Very interesting from the point of view of those of you that know the nest, because we've got 4 big posts in the middle of the circular structure. And if you think about somewhere like structure 10, where we've got a squared central area with a big wall around it enclosing it, and interestingly with structure 10 as well, it has almost like a little antechamber on just out the front of it. And at Ballynahattie, I'm fascinated by these 2 little things here. And in fact, beyond this, there's a large wooden wall as well, which has almost like little sentry posts within it. So are we seeing some kind of homology, some kind of link between areas that are very widespread? Have we got a translation into wood of ideas which we're finding up here in Orkney in stone? But whatever's happening, suddenly the pottery and the activities with which it's associated, with which it's bound up, are spreading to other areas. So what about the significance of the designs? But as I mentioned, they're geometric. Occasionally we might find the odd little spiral or something on groovedware, but overwhelmingly straight and incised lines. It must mean something. Well, there are possibilities. One possibility, and we've got Sarah Botfield in the audience at the moment who's doing a PhD on the subject, is that there may be links with natural phenomena, the way that rocks fracture, or possibly living things like trees and so on. Something that Sarah will be able to tell you a little bit more than me, and I'm sure you probably answer a question or 2 if you were asked, would you, on this one? Okay, great. But rather than stealing Sarah's thunder, what I'd like to do is suggest a couple of other possibilities as well. I'd like to go back to Ireland for this. So there is a very distinctive and very well-known art style associated with the big passage tombs in Ireland. You seem to have a couple of phases to it, a geometric phase and then a much more sort of fluid and swirly-whirly phase later on. But there are certain motifs that we find on the passage tomb art that we also find on groovedware pottery. Probably the most significant is this lozenge motif. It has been suggested that some of these motifs might have had particular significance within the tombs themselves. There was a paper that came out a little while ago by a fellow called Guillaume Robin that had suggested that spirals seem to be associated with entrances and exits. They seem to occur in the tombs at certain points where you're passing from one place to another. Interestingly enough, the famous triple spiral at Newgrange is right in the back slab of the tomb, and it's illuminated by the midwinter sunrise, little beam of light that shoots right down the passage and shines right on a little triple spiral. Almost a door that the living can't pass through. Stealing a little idea from Colin Richards there. But there is clearly some kind of significance to the designs. They must have meant something, but what is hard to tell. As passage tomb ideas move up into the west of Scotland, we find them in the Kilmartin Glen, for example. A couple of tombs here from Argyll, and again we've got the same motifs, triangles, nested lozenges on megalithic tombs. And if we come right up to Orkney, well, a big stone that was excavated a few years ago in structure 10, we've got exactly the same thing. We've got these little nested lozenges and triangles appearing. But this doesn't really go on to pottery in Ireland. Irish groovedware tends to be much plainer, it's much more reserved decoration, and it's probably an idea that's coming back from Orkney anyway. They don't transfer the ideas onto the pots. But here in Orkney, that's exactly what seems to happen. We're finding these designs on groovedware at a number of sites. This is, again, rather a dim slide, but you can see here we've got part of a lozenge motif on this particular pot. Was this one of yours, Joe? I can't remember. Was that one that you found?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, well done. Yeah, again, these motifs coming together to create little triangles and lozenges on the pottery at the nest. And I did mention the swirly-whirly, not swirly-whirly, the little undulating design made by the two grooves and then poking up and down. So in this case, it's not quite up and down. What they've done is they've created just a kind of little slashed cordon motif, little false relief cordon. But on this particular pot, again, going back to the Kilmartin Valley in our guide, it's a pot that's recently dated to about 2900 BC. And we've got an interesting little motif here, which is found on a lot of grooveware pottery. Where the lines come together, you sometimes find a little bit of applied clay that's slashed, and it looks, on a lot of these pots, it looks just like a knot. And I would suggest that a possibility that some of these lines are representing cordage, and that it might be that we're seeing what we call skeuomorphs. Now, a skeuomorph is, for those of you that haven't come across the word before, it's a translation of patterns and designs that you find on one type of material onto something else. So it could be a basketry design being transferred over into clay. And I have a suspicion with these that we might be looking at representations of certain types of containers. But again, it's something, it's a long shot, this one, so I'm not going to say this is definitely what was going on. But the translation into clay of other things might be one way of answering this. So let's look a little bit more at what happens outside of Orkney. My own project is looking at the dating of grooveware in particular, once it moves beyond Orkney. And I'm interested not so much just in the pots, but looking at the spread of the new ideas that grooveware seems to be associated with. And the situation in Scotland at the moment is we've got around about 100 sites on outside of Orkney that have produced grooveware pottery. And these little red dots on the map give you, it's not every one, but it gives you a rough idea of the kind of distribution. Quite a lot down the east. Not surprisingly, there's not been as much work done over in the west, and we're looking at a more, probably a more difficult environment to live in on a lot of the west coast. But we've got about 90 radiocarbon dates now, so we're getting an idea about the kind of age of the sites. And the pottery is turning up in all sorts of contexts. A lot of it is found in pits. So a little example of one of the sites there, Kintore and Midmill, and I showed you a pot from Kintore earlier on. It's very common in the Neolithic to dig pits and then backfill them really quickly. And I think you know that very well from your trench, don't you? Absolutely. Just digging a pit and then filling it in before there's been any chance for the sides to erode. Now, the pits we've got at the Ness of Brodgar don't seem to have anything in them. But elsewhere in Scotland, and England and Ireland as well, we're finding specially chosen sherds of pottery, often really nicely decorated ones. And sometimes they're arranged in careful ways around the bottom of the pit. And we find this before grooveware appears, and we find it with grooveware as well. We've got pottery at timber and stone circles, and I've already mentioned Callanish, and I've mentioned Balbirnie down in Fife there, with its early dates about 3000 BC. We've got grooveware turning up at palisaded enclosures, probably a little bit later in date, some of these great big sites with huge timbers being used to create huge enclosures later on in the Neolithic. We've got pottery turning up in chambered cairns, grooveware. Now, the chambered cairns are a little bit earlier in date, and some of them are anyway, so quite why the pots might be going into tombs that are already becoming a little bit unfashionable, I don't know. But it suggests, along with the pits, that people might be adopting this new style of pottery and using it in ways that they were already using pots in the earlier part of the Neolithic. And we've got it occurring at settlements. A little example there from Doylin out in South Uist in the Western Isles. And finally, we've got one or two really odd places where grooveware has been found. There's a site not far from Dunragget down here called My Plantation. And My Plantation is a series of 3 or 4 pits, quite deep pits. And at the bottom of the pits, they found wooden stakes stuck into the ground. And it's been suggested that these were pitfall traps. And the animals might have been driven in, and in they go, and they're impaled on the stakes at the bottom. So a piece of grooveware in there. And at Uford West over here in close to Edinburgh, we've got an old long barrow with a big pit next to it, a long sort of trench, and there's grooveware going in there as well. So it's cropping up in all different kinds of places. Might have been used in different ways by people in different areas. It doesn't look greatly different from one place to another. There are certain things that seem to be common to the eastern sites, certain designs. Here we go, we've got a little up and down line motif again, and look how similar to the pot from the nest that Joe found is to the pot from Kintor in Aberdeenshire. You could almost swap one for the other. But there certainly seems to be a movement down the east of these ideas. Pots from sites around Inverness actually have a lot of similarities with some of the pots up in Orkney. But over in the west, I think there's a slight difference. This particular style with dotty infill and lozenges with dot infill is very common. And although it's very hard to see on here, there's a particular way that lines come off at odd angles and so on. But I don't think this is massively significant. I don't think this is an entirely different style of pottery. I think we could perhaps think of it more along the lines of regional dialects of grooved-ware. That certain things are becoming like you get a dialect word in one place but not in another. Some things are becoming more common. Some of them are shared, but others are just kept within the local area. But again, very close similarities with some of the stuff that we found up in Orkney. Here's an example of a chamber cairn where pots have been, a grooved-ware pots found. This is a lovely little site called Unival on South Uist, and there's the pot that was found there, very similar to some of the stuff that we find in Orkney. But we get very few grooved-ware pots in burial contexts. Just the odd one here and there. It's been suggested by Neil Carlin, an Irish archaeologist, that at the time that grooved-ware was coming into use, people were moving away from the tombs and focusing on the inside of the tombs as a significant thing to do. And they start to become interested in activities outside tombs. And they're placing things around the edge and the outside. And it might be that only a small elite group of people was actually getting into the tombs. A lot of the grooved-ware around Newgrange and Knowth was outside the tombs. There's very little of it inside. So it's something that's kind of going out of fashion, and it might be that some people are clinging on to old ideas even when they're adopting new types of pots. This little site at Overhales, down in the Lothians again. Here's an example of one of the pit deposits that I told you about. So just these odd pits that are dug, possibly with, well, it's very hard to say exactly what people's settlement was like at the time. But in this case, the suggestion is that it was just pits around a fairly ephemeral little settlement, possibly from groups of people that were living a fairly mobile lifestyle. Right, grooved-ware didn't stand still. We've got a situation now where we've seen that it's a style of pottery that developed in probably the last couple of centuries of the 4th millennium BC, and seemingly from the dates we've got, it's happening here in Orkney. It's associated with the growth of the big settlements. It's linked to people that are moving around, and I've suggested that it might be certain emergent groups, perhaps in an increasingly stratified society, that were interconnecting with each other. But it didn't stay absolutely the same all the way through the Neolithic. There were some changes. So as we get towards the end of the Neolithic, we start to find this very distinctive type of grooved-ware, with these vertical cordons. I mentioned skewer morphs earlier on. This really does look like basketry to me. We've even got little crisscross infills in between the cordons there and little patterns on the top there. In fact, this particular vessel from Little, very close to Perth, we've got a couple of little perforations through a log. And that looks very much like this pot was to be suspended as well. And we've got pots, I also mentioned the big palisaded enclosure. So I'll give you one example of this, which is a site called Forteviot, which is just outside Perth. And this is a place that clearly had significance over a very, very long period of time. A massive palisade of huge posts. In fact, there's a second site very close by, Ledketty, another series of big palisaded enclosures. There's no actual grooved-ware from Forteviot, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if it turns up there it's the right age, but we have got grooved-ware from Ledketty close by. So one of the interesting things about this site, I know it's very difficult to see in the light that we've got, but we've got this big enclosure of posts coming around here, and a strange sort of, almost like a kind of entranceway, if you like, of posts leading into the site. And some of the later activities, there's burials at the site, including a spectacular one with a gold-handled dagger and all sorts of lovely things like that. There's henge monuments inside this big palisade. So exactly what these things were, we don't know. And they get burned down, many of them as well. Whether this is a hostile act or whether it's something that's involved in the ritual use of the sites is a little bit hard to say, but to burn down some of these huge posts would have taken a lot of effort, probably piling brushwood against them and all sorts, because some of the posts are absolutely enormous. So there are people elsewhere that are beginning to change the styles, and it may be that we've got shifting relationships between communities. There is a suggestion with Vanessa Brodgar, and possibly with sites like Poole as well, based on some of the dating, that the significance of the site might not have lasted all the way through the Neolithic, that it could have had a big fluorescence between about 3000 BC and 2800, and then a kind of decline after that. Some environmental archaeologists have tried to link this perhaps to climate change, although the specialists can't really agree with each other. There are other environmental specialists that say, no, that's not the case, the evidence doesn't really support it. But it could also be to do with the balance of power shifting from one area to another. Maybe Orkney was becoming a little bit peripheral. But either way, a lot of the pots that we find out at the Ness of Brodgar are great big chunky things with heavy applied cordons, and this is something very distinctive about the later groovedware in Orkney. It develops its own distinctive, you could say, with some of the pots, they look quite coarse, so almost a kind of coarse dialect. And then it just sort of looks like it's becoming on the edge of things. I can't finish the talk really without mentioning this place. And of course, we all know how Stonehenge was built. It has been suggested by the archaeologist Alex Gibson that Stonehenge is the best example of a timber circle that we have anywhere in Britain. And he's absolutely right. The thing about Stonehenge is that it's built using woodworking techniques. The way that the stones are put together use joints that you would find in woodwork. So we may be seeing a timber circle translated into stone. But the late phases at Stonehenge, the big stones, are going up right at the very end of the Neolithic. And there are changes occurring around about this time. Something is happening, not just in Britain, but in the continent, over the continent and northwestern Europe in general. At Stonehenge, we've got a nearby site, Durrington Walls, which I've mentioned briefly, which is quite possibly the place where the builders of Stonehenge lived. It's a whole series of small houses. It dates to the same period that the large stones are going up at Stonehenge. And there are vast quantities of grooveware there. And there's also huge amounts of pork being consumed. And we know from the age of the pigs, and at that stage that pigs would probably have been born in the springtime. Judging from the age of the pigs, which we can ascertain from the bones, they're being killed at midwinter. So it's likely that people were gathering there at midwinter, they're having huge feasts, they're consuming it in this very distinctive style of pottery, which is then being disposed of nearby, and perhaps going over and building or using this huge timber circle in stone. And it's almost the sort of the epitome of this late Neolithic, distinctive late Neolithic culture. So could this be that things have shifted, the focus has shifted to Wessex, or possibly out to the Boyne Valley in Ireland, or elsewhere, or certainly slightly away from Orkney? There's something else significant about Stonehenge. Very nearby, at Amesbury, which has been in for other reasons recently, there was an excavation that discovered the grave of what's known as the Amesbury Archer, a man who had a very poorly leg, but who appears to have come over from the continent. And it's one of the earliest graves in Britain that has this type of pottery, which is not groovedware. This is beaker pottery. This sinuous style, which we know has come over from the continent. There are much earlier dates for beaker pottery outside of Britain than there are in Britain. It seems to have arrived in Britain round about 2450, maybe a little bit before. It's likely that the first beaker users were associated with the earliest use of metals in Britain as well. They may have been prospecting for copper or something like that. But coming initially in small numbers and bringing a new way of thinking and a new way of doing things. First of all, the distinctive style of pottery. There are new artifacts, such as new types of arrowhead, as I say, the earliest use of metals and things like that. New types of burial, individual burial, crouch burials under small mounds, round mounds, with distinctive artifacts such as this little, what we call a bracer, which is often found next to the arm bones of beaker burials, and it's often interpreted as something that prevents the bowstring from cutting you when it whips, when you fire an arrow. Jet jewellery and so on, little copper daggers. So this is a very different set of materials. Now, earlier on, I mentioned that it's become possible to extract DNA from ancient bones. And I talked about how this has shown us, or seems to be showing us, that large numbers of people are coming in at the beginning of the Neolithic. Well, something very similar seems to happen in the earliest part of the Bronze Age. So from 2450, something like that, onwards. Larger numbers of people are coming in. In fact, a recent article has suggested that the population turnover is, I think the exact figures were 90% plus or minus 2, minimum. So we are looking at an enormous change in the genetic makeup of Britain and Ireland at this time. Significant numbers of people are coming in. And the Neolithic people have contributed a very small percentage of the DNA in the modern genome of a typical modern British or Irish person. So, exactly what does this all mean? What's the nature of this change? Is this a peaceful infiltration of people? Large numbers of people coming over, but perhaps with a different way of life and simply intermarrying? Or is there something more sinister going on? Or is it different between one region and the next? Could it be that Stonehenge and Durrington Walls are the last flourish of the groovedware using people and their way of life in the face of what new ideas flooding in from outside that are irresistible? The latest dates we have for groovedware are coming in shortly after the arrival of beaker pottery, so perhaps 2300 BC. I've recently got some new dates for a site called Licklor in Perthshire that seem to be about that age. But much after that, grooveware's gone, and it's all beakers or nothing, and then new indigenous styles of pottery come in. Returning to the Ness of Brodgar to finish off, we see that the dating of the Ness of Brodgar is a little bit tricky, because it's very difficult to date stone structures. Stone structure, you can't get a radiocarbon date from stone, so we've got to find the right kind of materials in the right sort of place if we want to date the buildings themselves. But we can apply new statistical techniques, Bayesian analysis. It's a bit of black magic as far as I'm concerned, but I'm told that it refines dates very closely. And if we look at Bayesian analysis, well, probably the latest structure at the Ness of Brodgar is this large structure 10. And at the end of its life, a huge deposit of cattle bone was placed around the edge of structure 10. Probably 400 or so cows, judging from this scaling up from the small area that's been investigated in detail. Now, one of these Bayesian models suggests that the cattle may have been deposited around the structure 2340 to 2200 BC, something like that. The second model suggests 2465 to 2360. This is right at the beginning of the Bronze Age. So, what are we looking at? Are we again, as with Stonehenge, looking at the last flourishings of a dying culture, perhaps in the face of dramatic change from the continent? Are we looking at something a bit more sinister? Are we looking at people coming in? Have the local people said, we're having a big feast with our own cows? Or has somebody else come in and said, we're having a big feast with your cows? There's a lot there. It must have had a big impact on the local people to have lost so many cattle in one go. There's not that many beakers in Orkney. And once we get into the Bronze Age, Orkney is well outside the mainstream, because the other thing it doesn't really have is metals. It's not producing vast quantities of copper or tin. And the focus has well and truly moved away, and the grooveware's gone, and we don't really see any echo of it anywhere else. Okay, so that's a potted history, if you like, of grooveware, and what I think is its possible significances as well. If you want to see some really nice grooveware, we've picked out a few prime examples of Orcadian grooveware for the exhibition that's on at the Orkney Museum at the moment. Do go in and have a look at it. There's some nice things that have been excavated at Crossy Crown, one or two things from the Ness of Brodgar as well. We've got some replica vessels to try and show you how the pots were made, a little video of one of them being made as well, and a few little ethnographic items that have come from Stromness Museum to illustrate how pots are used in other societies in ways that we wouldn't consider purely functional but have ritual, religious and magical significance to them as well. So do go along and have a look at that. And of course, if you haven't been out to look at the Ness yet, if you're up here on holiday or anything, do make the effort to come along. It's well worth it. And if you're there, look at the stone circles and barn house as well. I've gone through fairly quickly. I hope I haven't gone too fast, but anyway.